All right, welcome back to Tragedy and Hope Live. Before we get into the book today, we're going to do a little quick dive into the Trump White House ballroom and see what's going on there. Also, happy Friday the 13th, even though it's in February, kind of weird. But anyway, we're going to look at some of this information. All right, so the first article we got here is from Realtor.com, in which Trump says his $400 million White House ballroom is on budget and ahead of schedule as he reveals new renderings. So this is what it's supposed to look like. Now, interestingly enough, it's supposed to be on budget, even though the original budget was $200 million, but now it's up to $400 million, and this is just 3 days ago, right? They got some other pictures here of it. Apparently, it's going to be bigger than the White House itself, interestingly enough, which people are kind of concerned about. See, the cost has ballooned from 200 million to 300 million and now 400 million. But it's on budget, though. These people will just say anything. The White House said it's being funded by private donors. The old ballroom only held 200 people. The new one's going to hold 1,000 people. Right? It's going to be a 90,000 square foot ballroom, and the White House is only 55,000 feet. Interesting size there, 55,000. That's not like a Freemason number or anything like that. All right, so then we're going to jump over to this AP article real quick to find out who the donors are. There's 37 donors. Only 37 people are providing $400 million to the White House, to Trump directly, to have his name be put on the White House. Now, one of my theories is that one of the reasons why Trump is even running for president is the fact that he just wants to be put in the history books, and it's something that you can't purchase. Like, for example, name the top real estate agent in Rome, in like classic Rome, right? Name the top real estate agent from the Byzantine Empire. Name the top real estate agent from feudal Japan. Nobody knows, but everybody knows all the emperors and the kings and the presidents and the prime ministers and the chancellors and the czars, right? Because they get put in the history books, right? And you can't buy your way into the history books. You have to be elected a leader or a dictator or whatever, right? So he's saying it's paid for by his friends. So we're going to see who those people are. Philanthropy, the Adelson Family Foundation, Betty Wald Johnson Foundation, Laura and Isaac Perlmutter Foundation, Booz Allen Hamilton Lockheed Martin. Then we've got Union Pacific, Caterpillar, Next Era Energy, and Paolo Tiramani. Never even heard of that one. Then we've got Benjamin Leon Jr., Kelly Loeffler, and Jeffrey Sprecher, and of course, our favorites, the Lutnick family. Oh, look, Big Tobacco is also donating tons of money to Trump. The Altera Group and Reynolds American. Wonder why they're cracking down on vaping. I wonder why. There's no way that tobacco companies could be paying the government tons of money to keep people smoking, because that helps doctors and the tobacco company and all these other people. Okay, so in the cryptocurrency, we've got the Winklevoss twins, but they're separately listed: Coinbase, Ripple, and Tether. Then in communications, we've got Comcast, T-Mobile, and Hard Rock International. We've got some individuals. I don't even know who any of these people are. Edward and Sherry Glazer, Harold Ham, Stephen A. Schwartzman, Charles and Marissa Casa Carilla, Konstantin Slok Sokolov. All right. Then in the technology sector, we've got Meta, HP, Micron Technology, Amazon, Apple, Palantir, Google, and Microsoft. Just missing Netflix, pretty much. Okay, so we're going to focus in on this technology section because obviously it's I guess you can say it's a self-licking ice cream cone in this situation because Meta itself was created by In-Q-Tel, right? So it says, what is In-Q-Tel? In-Q-Tel is a not-for-profit venture capital firm based in Arlington, Virginia, that invests in technology companies to support the U.S. intelligence community, including the CIA. It focuses on providing advanced information technology to enhance intelligence capabilities. Now, you can look this stuff up yourself. It's true. There's really a CIA venture capital firm that goes around and invests in technologies to make sure that those technologies are under the control of the U.S. government or under control of the CIA. Now, we can look at, did In-Q-Tel fund Facebook, which is now Meta, right? Of course, the AI says there's no evidence that In-Q-Tel directly invested in Facebook, although some early investors in Facebook had connections to In-Q-Tel, right? But then if we look at this article here by inteltoday.org, they've got a supposed quote from a supposed CIA officer or agent named Tom Booker. Now he's saying about Facebook, they're talking about all the different companies in this article that have been funded by In-Q-Tel. And he's talking about Facebook. Now, a CIA officer claims the agency developed Facebook too. CIA agent Tom Booker said so in a recent interview. This is what Tom Booker said. I mean, come on, I've got shoes older than him, and he thinks he invented this incredibly huge communication system and spying tool. So now they're just straight up saying Facebook is a spying tool. This all began when he accidentally overheard some sexy girls talking about it at college, then was introduced to some computer experts at a frat party who just happened to be 10 years older than everyone else and wearing suits. We only chose him because he seemed astonishingly gullible. Right. They pretty much created Google Earth, In-Q-Tel did. Then we've also got a couple other companies that they Palantir, right? They funded it, so that means that they've got control in it because that's what they do. Google, right? Invested. You can see all the companies, right, that have been invested in by In-Q-Tel, which is just the CIA venture capital firm. So they invest in these companies to make sure that there are backdoors to spy on you and to monitor you and put you on a list when you say you're a white person that doesn't want to be replaced by an Indian guy, or you say you're a black person and you don't want to have to pay for welfare for women that don't want to date you. Get put on a list by the CIA. It's all funded by the CIA. Right. And these are the people that are the donors to Trump, to his ballroom, so that he can go down in history. And it's just funny because everyone's saying, oh, Trump can't get anything done. Trump can't get anything done. None of the stuff that people voted for, mass deportations, the Epstein files, a bunch of other stuff, no new wars. But he seems to be getting this done. And it's going to be bigger than the White House, which is just ridiculous. I mean, I would say that if he doesn't get any of this stuff done that he says, they should just cancel this. Like, seriously. They should just cancel it. Like, if he doesn't get, I mean, obviously he's not going to get mass deportations. If he can get one person arrested from the Epstein list, maybe that would work. You know what I'm saying? Or maybe even, I don't know, what else? He's obviously not going to be able to stop the war in Iran. And so we can see, you know, he's getting a lot. And I don't know what this means with the circles, but it seems like this Lutnick family is pretty high up there in the donations, along with the, you know, defense, and then the Adelson family. All right, interesting stuff, kinda interesting. So we can see that basically the CIA is behind funding a lot of these major tech companies, and they fund them specifically for the purpose so that they can get a backdoor into the company to use it as a spying apparatus for the intelligence agencies. And you could say it's a conspiracy and you could say it's made up, but it's right there. It's right there. All right. Gonna get into the book now. The Future in Perspective, on page 1217. It's like second paragraph down. Link to the PDF in the description. All right. Moreover, the incorporation of such a wide variety of peoples with such diverse traditions into the United Nations is also contributing to this process. We have seen that traditional China did not exercise power on the vast majority of its subjects, the peasants, in terms of force, rewards, or even ideology, but did so by social pressures through the intermediary of family and the gentry. Similarly, in Africa, power has been quite different in its character than it was in the traditional European state, and was based rather on kinship, social reciprocity, and religion. When African natives met to settle political disputes in battle, this was not, as in Europe, a clash of military force to settle the issue. Rather, it was an opportunity for spiritual entities to indicate their decision in the case. As soon as a few casualties appeared on one side, this was taken as an indication that the spirits concerned had made a decision adverse to that side, and accordingly, the victims' associates broke and ran, leaving the field to the other side. Like the medieval judicial trial by battle or by ordeal, this was not an effort to settle a dispute by force, but the attempt to give a spiritual entity an opportunity to reveal its decision. It may seem far-fetched to expect our state to succumb to the introduction of religious, magical, or spiritual influences such as this, unless it's spirit cooking. But there can be little doubt that social pressures, such as used to exercise influence in China, will become more influential in our power structures in the future. It seems likely also that there will be a certain revival of the use of intermediaries in removing or weakening the impact of sovereign power on ordinary individuals. This implies a growth of federalism in the structure of political power. On the whole, the history of federalism has not been a happy one. Even in the United States, the most significant example of a successful federalist structure in modern history, the Federalist principle has yielded ground to unitary government for 150 years or so. Moreover, in our own time, a number of efforts, chiefly British, to set up federal unions have failed. Thus, the Central African Federation of the Rhodesias and Nyasaland broke up after a few years, and the West Indies Federation was even less viable. The recent Malaysian Federation of the Malay States, Singapore, North Borneo, and Sarawak has been threatened with destruction by Indonesia, itself once a federal system that has now largely yielded to unitary developments. Nevertheless, the federal principle seems likely to grow as a method by which certain functions of government are allotted to one structure while other functions go to a narrower or wider structure. This tendency seems likely to arise from a number of influences, of which the chief might be 1. The inability of many of the new, small states to carry on all the functions of government independently and alone, and their consequent efforts to carry out some of them cooperatively. 2. The tendency for these new states to look to the United Nations to perform some of the most significant functions of government, such as defense of frontiers or maintaining public order, for example. Tanganyika recently disbanded its armed forces and entrusted its defense and public order to a Nigerian force under the United Nations control. 3. The need for economic cooperation over wider areas than the boundaries of most states in order to obtain the necessary diversity of resources within a single economic system, a need that will continue to encourage the establishment of customs unions and economic blocs, of which the European Common Market is the outstanding example. Similar unions are projected for Central America and other areas. Yeah, like the North American Union. The most interesting example of this process may be seen in the slow growth of some kind of multi-level federal structure covering much of tropical Africa. This arose from the disintegration of the French colonial system in Black Africa in 1956 to 1960 and was known as the Brazzaville 12 at first from December in 1960, but is now much expanded to include non-French areas under the name Union of African and Malagasy States. This union shows a tendency to become one of the middle layers in a multi-level political hierarchy. In this hierarchy, the top level is held by the United Nations and its associated functional bodies, such as the World Health Organization, UNESCO, the Food and Agricultural Organization, the ILO, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the International Court of Justice, and others. On the second level are various organizations that have pan-European or third bloc overtones, such as the European Common Market or its now stalemated political counterpart, along with Euratom, the European Coal and Iron Community, and some others. The de Gaulle veto on the continued development of these has suspended their growth and also any tendency for them to coalesce with a number of older French community organizations. On the third, fourth, and fifth level is a rather confused mass of organizations, of which the third consists of those which are pan-African in scope. The fourth are those allied with the UAMS, and the fifth are the relatively viable Brazzaville 12 projects. On the third level are such organizations as the Economic Commission for Africa South of the Sahara, the Technical Cooperation Commissions for Africa, the Scientific Council for Africa, 2 African Commissions of the World Conference of Organizations of the Teaching Professions, the African Trade Union Confederation, set up at Dakar in 1962, and a number of others. On the fifth level are a whole series of organizations associated with the Brazzaville 12, its semi-annual summit conferences of heads of state, its Secretary General and Secretariat, its Defense Union, its Organization for Economic Cooperation, and others. On the fourth level are similar organizations, including an assembly of heads of states, a council of members, and a secretariat general set up for the UAMS at Lagos in January 1962. Possibly these third, fourth, and fifth levels will coalesce and eliminate some reduplication as membership becomes firmer. On the sixth level are a number of local unions of states, such as those for local river controls, custom unions, and such. And on the seventh level are the individual states, which, in theory, like the states of the United States, will continue to hold full sovereignty. But when two-thirds votes on higher levels can make binding decisions on member states, or when states intend to vote as a bloc in the United Nations, or when states have reduced their military and police forces so that they are dependent on forces from higher levels to defend their territories or to maintain order, or when states look to higher levels for funds or investments or to restore their annual foreign exchange imbalances, the realities of sovereign power become dispersed and some areas of the world begin to look more like the Germanys of the late medieval period than like the nationalist sovereign states of the 19th century. So basically, there's six levels of government above the sovereign state level in the global New World Order. That's what he's saying. That before it even gets to your government, there's six levels of government before that have already basically made decisions. And especially if you need military help, financial help, or social help like education or road building, stuff like that, from the United Nations, World Bank, you're basically screwed. Because then now they get to vote on what your country does. How far this process will go, we cannot foretell, but the possibility of such developments should not be excluded by us just because they have not been experienced by us in recent generations. This is more than enough on the power patterns in our near future. We must now turn to a much briefer discussion of the patterns of economic and social life. There we see a most extraordinary contrast. While the economic life of Western society has been increasingly successful, in satisfying our material needs, the social aspect has become increasingly frustrating. There was a time not long ago when the chief aims of most Western men was for greater material goods and for rising standards of living. This was achieved at great social cost by the attrition or even destruction of much of social life, including the sense of community, fellowship, leisure, and social amenities. Looking backwards, we are fully aware of these costs in the original factory towns and urban slums, but looking about us today, we are often not aware of the great, often intangible cost of middle class living in suburbia or in the dormitory environs that surround European cities. The destruction of social companionship and solidarity, the narrowing influence of exposure to persons from a restricted age group or from a narrow segment of social class, the horrors of commuting, the incessant need for constant driving about to satisfy the ordinary needs of the family for groceries, medical care, entertainment, religion, or social experience, the prohibitive cost and inconvenience of upkeep and repairs, and in general the whole way of life of the suburban rat race, including the large scale need for providing artificial activities for children. We're not even going to get into what type of activities they're providing for children. Not going to get into it. Rebellion against this rat race has already begun. Not from the lower middle class who are just entering it and will aspire to it, but from the established middle class who have, as they say, had it. On the whole, the efforts to find a way out while still retaining a high standard of material living have not been successful, and the real rebellion is coming, as we shall see later, from their children. These have expanded the usual adolescent revolt against parental dominance and authority into a large scale rejection of parental values. One form of this revolt has been to modify the meaning of the expression high standard of living to include a whole series of desires and values that are not material and thus were excluded from the 19th century bourgeois understanding of the expression standard of living. Among these are two we have already listed as disconcerting elements in Africans' understanding of standard of living: small group interpersonal relationships and sex play. These changes, as we shall see, have come to represent a challenge to the whole middle class outlook. Social costs of the contemporary economic system are staggering. On the whole, they have been widely discussed and are generally recognized. As economic enterprises have become larger and more tightly integrated into one another, the freedom, individualism, and initiative traditionally associated with the modern economy, in contrast with the medieval rural economy, had to be sacrificed. The self reliant individual has gradually changed into the conformist organization man, the corporate guy, the corporate desk jockey. Routine has displaced risk, and subordination to abstractions has replaced the struggle with diverse concrete problems. The constantly narrowing range of possibilities for self expression has given rise to deep frustrations with their concomitant growth of irrational compensating customs, such as the obsession with speed, vicarious combativeness, especially in sports, the use of alcohol, tobacco, narcotics, and sex as stimulants, diversions and sedatives, and the rapid appearance and disappearance of fads in dress, social customs, and leisure activities. The most crucial have been the demand of the modern industrial and business system because of advancing technology for more highly trained manpower. Such training requires a degree of ambition, self discipline, and future preference that many persons lack or refuse to provide, with the result that a growing, lowest social class of the social outclass, the lumpen proletariat, has reappeared. This group of rejects from our bourgeois industrial society provide one of our most intractable future problems because they are gathered in urban slums, have political influence, and are socially dangerous. In the United States, where these people congregate in the largest cities and are often Negroes or Latin Americans, they are regarded as racial or economic problems, but they are really an educational and social problem for which economic or racial solutions would help little. This group is most numerous in the more advanced industrial areas and now form more than 20% of the American population. Since they are a self perpetuating group and have many children, they are increasing in numbers faster than the rest of the population. Their self perpetuating characteristic as a group is not based on biological differences, but on sociological factors, chiefly on the fact that disorganized, undisciplined, present preference parents living under chaotic economic and social conditions are most unlikely to train their children in the organized, disciplined future preference or orderly habits the modern economic system requires in its workers, so that the children, like their parents, grow up as unemployables. This is not a condition that can be cured by providing more jobs, even if the jobs are in the proper areas, because the jobs require characteristics these victims of anomie do not possess and are unlikely to acquire. Now, I did a video on anomie like 8 years ago. I think it's called like 19th century sociologist predicts MGTOW. I think that's what it's called. All this leads to one of the most significant of current changes, The changes in attitudes and outlooks. At this point, we shall not discuss the middle class outlook and its challenges, which are the central aspect of this subject in the United States, but shall restrict ourselves to an equally large subject, the changes in the outlook of Western society as a whole, especially in Europe. The intellectual and religious aspects of any society, including all those things I call patterns of outlook, change at least as rapidly as the more material aspects of the society and are generally less noticed. Among these are the most significant and the least noticed are the categories into which any society divides its experiences in order to think about them or talk about them, and the values the society, often an unconscious consensus, places upon these categories. In every society, there are certain groups, perhaps an intellectual elite, who think new thoughts, new at least in comparison with what just went before. In time, some of these thoughts spread and become familiar until it may seem that everybody is thinking them. Of course, everybody is not, because in every society there are three other groups: the large group who do not think at all, the substantial group who are not aware of anything new and who retain the same outlook for years and even generations, and the small group who are always opposed to the consensus simply because opposition has become an end in itself. In spite of these complexities, we can still look at the past and see a sequence of prevalent outlooks, often with rather confused periods of transition in between. Over the past 2 centuries, there have been 5 such stages: the Enlightenment in 1730 to 1790, the Romantic movement in 1790 to 1850, the Age of Scientific Materialism in 1850 to 1895, the period of irrational activism of 1895 to 1945, and our new age of inclusive diversity since 1945. These changing patterns of outlooks arise because men are complicated creatures trying to operate in a complex universe. Both man and universe are dynamic or changeable in time, and the chief additional complexity is that both are changing in a continuum of abstraction as well as in the more familiar continuum of space-time. The continuum of abstraction simply means that the reality in which man and the universe function exist in 5 dimensions. Of these, the dimension of abstraction covers a range from the most concrete and material end of reality to, at the opposite extreme, the most abstract and spiritual end of reality, with every possible gradation between these two ends along the intervening dimension that determine reality, including the 3 dimensions of space, the fourth of time, and this 5th dimension of abstraction. This means that man is concrete and material at one end of his person, is abstract and spiritual at the other end, and covers all the gradations between, with a large central zone concerned with his chaos of emotional experiences and feelings. In order to think about himself or the universe with the more abstract and rational end of his being, man has to categorize and to conceptualize both his own nature and the nature of reality, while in order to act and to feel on the less abstract end of his being, he must function more directly outside the limits of categories without the buffer of concepts. This man might look down at his own being as divided into 3 levels: body, emotions, and reason. The body, functioning directly in space-time abstraction, is much concerned with concrete situations, individual and unique events, and at a specific time and place. The middle levels of his being are concerned with himself and his reactions to reality in terms of feelings and emotions as determined by endocrine and neurological reactions. The upper level of his being are concerned with his neurological analysis and manipulation of conceptualized abstractions. The three corresponding operations of his being are sensual, emotional, or intuitive, and rational. The sequence of intellectual history is concerned with the sequence of styles or fads that have been prevalent, one after another, as to what emphasis or combinations of man's three levels of operations would be used in his effort to experience life and to cope with the universe. In the most general terms, we might say that primitive man emphasized an empirical approach to these problems with use of man's sensual equipment as an chief emphasis on specific concrete situations. Archaic man, say from 5000 BC to about 500 BC in Eurasia, emphasized man's emotional and intuitive equipment with emphasis on symbols, ritual, myth, and magical actions. Classical man, say from 500 BC to 500 AD, emphasized man's rational equipment and regarded man's concepts as the major portion of reality. But Western man since 500 AD has sought to find some combination of all three parts of his equipment that will provide satisfactory explanation and successful operation in terms both of man's nature and of the universe. The combinations he has tried provide the changing sequence of intellectual history. The Age of Enlightenment, following on the successes of the Age of Newton, which had discovered a rational and mechanical explanation of the material universe, tried to apply the same techniques to man and society and came up with a static, mechanical, and rationalist conception of both. The inadequacy of this view of man, already rejected by poets and literary figures in the mid 18th century, led to its general rejection as inadequate because of the excesses of the French Revolution. The following Romantic period, accordingly, adopted a much more rational picture of man, of society, and of the universe. As a consequence, emphasis shifted from the earlier rational, mechanical, and static views to irrational and dynamic views of man and society. This period of Romanticism, about 1790 to 1850, was marked by poets of storm and stress, the Gothic revival, and a growing emphasis on history as the correct key to understanding man and society. The period associated with Hegel, Hugo, and Heine culminated in Karl Marx's Communist Manifesto in 1848, which found the key to man's social position in past struggles. The third generation of the 19th century, 1850 to 1895, was in an age of science and rationalism whose typical figures were Darwin and Bismarck. While emphasizing the empirical and rational aspects of science, it tried to apply these to biology and to history in terms of a scientific materialism that could explain biology and change as Newton's science had explained mechanics. By the end of the century, man was frustrated and disillusioned with scientific method and materialism and with emphasis on the non-human world, and was turning once again to the problems of man and society with a conviction that these problems could be handled only by non-rational methods and by the clash of contending forces, since the problems themselves were too complex, too dynamic, too irrational to be settled by science or even by human thought. The result was a new period, the age of irrational activism. The result was a new period, The age of irrational activism. It began with men like Henry Bergson and Sigmund Freud, who emphasized the non-rational nature of the universe and of man, quickly shifted Darwin's doctrines of struggle and survival from non-human nature to human society, and rejected rationalism as slow, superficial, and an inhibition on both action and survival. As Bergson said in his Creative Evolution, 1907, the intellect is characterized by a natural inability to comprehend life. Instinct, on the contrary, is molded on the very form of life. This period felt that man and nature and human society were all basically irrational. Reason, regarded as a late and rather superficial accretion in the process of human evolution, was considered inadequate to plumb the real nature of man's problems and was regarded as an inhibitor on the full intensity of his actions, an obstacle to the survival of himself as an individual and his group, the nation. Any effort to apply reason or science based on rational analysis and evaluation would be a slow and frustrating effort. Slow because the process of human rationality is always slow, frustrating because it cannot plumb into the real depths and natures of man's experience, and because it can always turn up as many and as good reason for any course of action as it can for the opposite course of action. The effort to do this was dangerous because, as the thinker poised in indecision, the man of action struck, eliminated the thinker from the scene, and survived to determine the future on the basis of continued action. To the theorist of these views, the thinker would always be divided, hesitant, and weak, while the man of action would be unified, decisive, and strong. This point of view, nourished on Marx and Heinrich von Treitschke, never heard of that guy, justified class conflict and national warfare, and formed the background for the cult of violence that was reflected in the political assassinations of 1898 to 1914 and the imperialist aggression that began with Japan, Italy, and Britain in China, Ethiopia, and South Africa in 1894 to 1899. The explicit justification of this view could be found in George Sorel's Reflections sur la Violence in 1908, or in the political events of the summer of 1914. From that fateful summer, for more than 40 years, higher levels of violence became the solution of all problems, whether it was the question of winning a war, Stalin's efforts to reindustrialize Russia, Hitler's efforts to settle the Jewish problem, Rupert Brooke's efforts to find meaning in life, Japan's desire to find a solution to economic depression, the English-speaking nation's search for security, Italy's search for glory, or Franco's desire to preserve the status quo in Spain. The culmination of the process in total irrationalism and total violence was Nazism, the revolution of nihilism. Expressed explicitly, this cult of irrational activism was based on the belief that the universe was dynamic and largely irrational. As such, any effort to deal with it by rational means will be futile and superficial. Moreover, rationalism, by paralyzing man's ability to act decisively, will expose him to destruction in a world whose chief features include struggle and conflict. Men came to believe that only violence had survival value. The resulting cult of violence permeated all human life. By mid-century, the popular press, literature, the cinema, sports, and all major human concerns had embraced this cult of violence. The books of Mickey Spillane or Raymond Chandler sold millions to satisfy this need. Humphrey Bogart became the most popular film hero because he courted women with a blow to the jaw. On a somewhat more profound level, the Nazi Party mobilized popular support with a program of blood and soil, Blut und Boden, while the fascists in Italy covered every wall with their slogan, Believe, Obey, Fight. In neither was there any expectation that men should think or analyze. On the highest philosophic levels, the new attitude was justified. Bergson appealed to intuition and Hitler used it. Other philosophers vied with one another to demonstrate that the old mechanism of abstract rational thought must be rejected as irrelevant, superficial, or meaningless. Those new atheists always coming in. The semanticist rejected logic by rejecting the idea of general categories or even of definition of terms. That's like Destiny's whole debate style. What do you mean the thing? What is a chair? Define a chair. What is a salad? Define a salad. According to them, because everything is constantly changing, no term can remain fixed without at once becoming irrelevant. The meaning of any word dependent on the context in which it was used. Since this was different every time it was used, the meaning, consisting of a series of connotations based on all previous uses of the term, is different at each use. Postmodernism. Every individual who uses a term is simply the culmination of all his past experiences that make him what he is. Since experience never stops, he is a different person every time he uses a term, and it has a different meaning for him. On this basis, the Italian playwright Luigi Pirandello, 1867 to 1936, wrote a series of works to show the constantly changing nature of personality, which is also a reflection of the context in which it operates, so that each person who meets someone knows him as a different personality. The most widely read of the 20th century philosophers, the existentialists, reflected this same attitude, although they could agree on almost nothing. In general, they were skeptical of any general principles about reality, but recognized that reality did exist for each individual as the concrete instance of time, place, and context in which he acted. Thus, he must act. In order to act, he must make a decision, a commitment to something that would give him a basis from which to act. By acting, he experiences reality and to that extent knows and demonstrates, at least to himself, that there is a reality. All these ideas, reflecting the disjointed malaise of the century, permeated the outlook of the period and left it hungry for meaning, for identity, for some structure or purpose in human experience. Yeah, because once you take out all purpose out of the universe, what is the purpose? What's the purpose of a rock? Does a rock have a purpose? Well, if a rock doesn't have a purpose and a human's basically just made up of matter just like a rock, then how can a human have purpose? I mean, what's the purpose of a rock? What does a rock have? Yeah, the rock's purpose is to exist. The rock exists, and that's its purpose. Insanity, neurosis, suicide, and all kinds of irrational obsessions and reactions filled increasing human rules in human life. Most of these were not even recognized as being irrational or obsessive. Speed, alcohol, sex, coffee, and tobacco screened man off from living, injuring his health, stultifying his capacity to think, to observe, or to enjoy life, without his realizing that these were the shields he adopted to conceal from himself the fact that he was no longer really capable of living, because he no longer knew what life was and could see no purpose or meaning in it. See what I'm saying? Like, yeah, once the philosophers, like the thought leaders of your like time period, declare that there is no such thing as purpose, and there's basically no such thing as reality except existing in your own brain as some type of subjective object or like subjective thing, abstract thing, then yeah, people are going to be like, well, life has no meaning. Life has no purpose because the highest level, if most people don't think and they just consume, the art and philosophy that's being pushed down from these higher levels, and then the highest level people are saying that they're just sitting there all day arguing that life has no purpose. What do you mean your brain has a purpose? What do you mean your body has a purpose? What do you mean nature has a purpose? No, it doesn't have a purpose. What do you mean it has a purpose? It's like, well, it seems like everything's doing stuff, right? But they're just saying, oh, well, you just have to do stuff in order to make it seem like you're alive. Like you're just forced to act because that's what makes reality real. His capacity to live or to experience life dwindled. He sought to reach it by seeking more vigorous experiences that might penetrate the barriers surrounding him. The result was mounting sensationalism. In time, nothing made much impression unless it was concerned with shocking violence, perversion, or distortion. Along with this, ability to communicate dwindled. The old idea of communication as an exchange of concepts represented by symbols was junked. Instead, symbols had quite different connotations for everyone concerned, simply because everyone had a different past experience. A symbol might have meaning for two persons, but it did not have the same meaning. It soon was regarded as proper that words represent only the writer's meaning and need have no meaning at all for the reader. Thus appeared private poetry, personal prose, and meaningless art in which the symbols have ceased to be symbols because they do not reflect any common background of experience that could indicate their meaning as shared communication or experience. Right? It's like the Make America Great thing, right? Half the people are like, oh, well, America was great before, and then the other half are like, oh, America sucked before, and then it's like, even though the symbol's the same, everyone's interpreting it differently. These productions, the fads of the day, were acclaimed by many as works of genius. Those who questioned them and asked their meaning were airily waved aside as unforgivable Philistines. They were told that no one any longer sought meaning in literature or art, but rather sought experiences. Thus, to look at a meaningless painting became an experience. These fads followed one another, reflecting the old pretenses but under different names. Thus, Dada, following World War I, eventually led to the absurd following World War II. But even as this process continued, 20 years after Hiroshima, deep within the social context of the day, new outlooks were rising that made the views associated with irrational activism increasingly irrelevant. One of these we have already mentioned: the victory of rational analysis, operational research, and organized scientific attitudes over irrationality, will, intuition, and violence in World War II reversed the trend. Nothing succeeds like success, and no success is greater than the ability to survive and find solutions to critical problems involving existence itself. The West in World War II and in the post-war period, in spite of the hysterical protest of the extremists, showed once again that it was able to overcome aggression, narrow intolerance, hatred, tribalism, totalitarianism, selfishness, arrogance, imposed uniformity, and all the evils the West had recognized as evils throughout its history. It not only won the war, it solved the great economic crisis, prevented the extension of tyranny while still avoiding World War III, and it did all this in a typical Western way by fumbling, cooperatively down a road paved with good intentions. The final result was a triumph of incalculable magnitude for the outlook of the West. The outlook of the West is that broad middle way about which the fads and foibles of the West oscillate. It is what is implied by what the West says it believes, not at one moment, but over the long succession of moments that form the history of the West. From that succession of moments, it is clear that the West believes in diversity rather than in uniformity, in pluralism rather than in monism or dualism, in inclusion rather than exclusion, in liberty rather than in authority, in truth rather than in power, in conversation rather than in annihilation, and in the individual rather than in the organization, in reconciliation rather than in triumph, in heterogeneity rather than in homogeneity, in relativisms rather than in absolutes, and in approximations rather than in final answers. The West believes that man and the universe are both complex and that the apparently discordant parts of each can be put into a reasonably workable arrangement with a little goodwill, patience, and experimentation. In the man, the West sees body, emotion, and reason as all equally real and necessary, and is prepared to entertain discussions about their relative interrelationship, but is not prepared to listen for long to any intolerant insistence that any one of these has the final answer. The West has no faith in final answers today. It believes that all answers are unfinal because everything is imperfect, although possibly getting better and thus advancing towards a perfection the West is prepared to admit may be present in some remote and almost unattainable future. Similarly, in the universe, the West is prepared to recognize that there are material aspects, less material aspects, immaterial aspects, and spiritual aspects, although it is not prepared to admit that anyone yet has a final answer on the relationship of these. Similarly, the West is prepared to admit that society and groups are necessary, while the individual is important, but it is not prepared to admit that either can stand alone or be made the ultimate value to sacrifice of the other. Where rationalists insist on polarizing the continua of human experience into antithetical pairs of opposing categories, the West has constantly rejected the implied need for rejection of one or the other by embracing both. This Catholic attitude goes back to the earliest days of Western society when its outlook was being created in the religious controversies of the preceding classical civilization. Among these controversies were the following: 1. Was Christ man or God? 2. Was salvation to be secured by God's grace or by man's good works? 3. Was the material world real and good, or was spirituality real and good? 4. Was the body worthy of salvation, or was the soul only to be saved? 5. Was the truth found only by God's revelation, or was it to be found by man's experience, history? 6. Should man work to save himself or to save others? 7. Does man owe allegiance to God or to Caesar? 8. Should man's behavior be guided by reason or by observation? 9. Can man be saved inside the church or outside it? In each case, with vigorous partisans clamoring on both sides, and in many cases still clamoring, the answer, reached as a consensus built up by long discussion, was both. In fact, a correct definition of the Christian tradition might be well expressed in that one word, both. Throughout its long history, controversy over religion in Western society has been based on a disturbance of the arrangement or balance within that both. From this religious basis established on both as early as the Council of Nicaea in 325 and Chalcedon in 451, the outlook of the West developed and spread with the growth of the new Christian civilization of the West to replace the dying classical civilization. And today, when the civilization of the West seems as if it may too be dying, we may reassure ourselves by recalling that our civilization has saved itself before by turning its back to its tradition of inclusive diversity. This apparently is what has been happening since 1940. It was inclusive diversity that created the nuclear bomb in World War II, and it may well be inclusive diversity that will save the West in the post-war world. Any outlook or society that finds its truth in inclusive diversity or in both obviously faces a problem of relationships. If man finds the truth by using body, emotions, and reason, these diverse talents must be placed in some workable arrangement with one another. So too must service to God and to Caesar, or to self and to fellow man. In an age like ours, in which all these relationships have become disrupted and discordant, such relationships can be reestablished by discussion and testing. But in this process, each discussant must rely on his experience. The great body of such experience, however, will not be found among living discussants whose whole lives have been passed in a culture in which these relationships were discordant, but in the experience of those whose lives were lived in earlier ages before the relationship in question became discordant. I think that's kind of where the whole like make America great again thing is coming in. This gives rise to the typical Western solution of relying on experience and at the same time helps the society to link up with its traditions, the most therapeutic action in which any society can engage. From this examination of the traditions of the West, we can formulate the pattern of outlook on which this tradition is based. It has 6 parts. 1. There is a truth, a reality. Thus, the West rejects skepticism, solipsism, and nihilism. 2. No person, group, or organization has the whole picture of the truth. Thus, there is no absolute or final authority. 3. Every person of goodwill has some aspect of the truth, some vision of it from the angle of his own experience. Thus, each has something to contribute. 4. Through discussion, the aspects of the truth held by many can be pooled and arranged to form a consensus closer to the truth than any of the sources that contributed to it. See, now I think this is where a lot of leftists get confused because, like, I was watching the Andrew Wilson debate and some like leftist guy like a couple days ago, and the guy just couldn't get that one, there is truth. But just because there is truth and just because we can't all know the 100% absolute truth, then they go to 4 and then they think, oh, well, we just have to discuss and decide and then like basically and then just goes into democracy where it's like, well, whatever the majority of people decide is morally true, that just becomes true. And it's like, no, that's not how it works. There is truth. And then you discuss and try to figure out if you can figure out what is true. You don't create the truth by discussing it. It's just that we can't, like, we get closer to the truth when we like challenge each other and, you know, kind of figure out getting closer to the truth, right? This consensus is a temporary approximation of the truth, which is no sooner made than new experiences and additional information make it possible for it to be reformulated in a closer approximation of the truth by continued discussion. 6. Thus, Western man's picture of the truth advances by successive approximations closer and closer to the whole truth without ever reaching it. This methodology of the West is basic to the success, power, and wealth of Western civilization. It is reflected in all successful aspects of Western life from the earliest beginnings to the present. It has been attacked and challenged by all kinds of conflicting methods and outlooks, by all kinds of alternate attitudes based on narrowness and rigidity, but it has reappeared again and again as the chief source of strength of that amazing cultural growth of which we are part. This method has basically been the method of operation in Western religious history, despite the many lapses of Western religion into authoritarian, absolute, rigid, and partial affirmations. The many problems previously listed that faced the Church at the time of the Council of Nicaea were settled by this Western method. Throughout Western religious history, in spite of the frequent outbursts by dissident groups insisting that the truth was available, total, explicit, final, and authoritative in God's revelation, Western religious thought has continued to believe that revelation itself is never final, total, complete, or literal, but is a continuous symbolic process that must be interpreted and reinterpreted by discussion. The method of the West, even in religion, has been this. The truth unfolds in time by a cooperative process of discussion that creates a temporary consensus, which we hope will form successive approximations growing closer and closer to the final truth, to be reached only in some final stage of eternity. In the Christian tradition, the stages in this unfolding process for each individual are numerous. They include 1. Man's intuitive sense of natural law and morality, 2. The Old Testament, 3. The New Testament, 4. The long series of church councils and ecclesiastical promulgations that will continue indefinitely into the future, 5. For each individual a continued process of knowledge in eternity after death, and finally, 6. The beatific vision. Until this final stage, all versions of the truth, even when their factual content is based on divine revelation, must be understood and interpreted by community discussions in terms of past experiences and traditions. This version of the religious tradition of the West as an example of the Western outlook as a whole may seem to many to be contradicted by the narrow intolerance, rigid bigotry, and relentless persecutions that have disfigured so much of the religious history of the West. This is true, and it is a clear indication that individuals and groups can fall far short of their own traditions, can lose these for long periods, and can even devote their lives to fighting against them. But the traditions of the West, certainly the most remarkable any civilization has had, always seem to come back and march on to other victories. Even in our day, the Vatican Council too, we can see what outsiders may regard as surprising efforts to apply Western traditions to an organization which, to most outsiders and even, perhaps, to most insiders, must appear as one of the most authoritarian organizations ever created. But the tradition is there, however buried or forgotten, and the realization of this has made Vatican Council II a symbol of hope even to non-Catholics and even to those who realize it will not do half the things that are crying urgently to be done. Before we leave this subject, concerned with an area, religion, and an organization, the Roman Catholic Church, where we might expect the tradition of the West to be weak or even absent, we might comment on one other issue. The rigidity of Western religious thought that often seems to be unappreciative of the Western tradition, although fundamentally is not, is often explained by the role divine revelation plays in Western religion. The Word of God may seem to many a rigid and inflexible element repugnant to the flexible and tentative outlook I have identified as the tradition of the West. But on an early page of the new version of Thomas Aquinas, now appearing in English in 60 volumes, we read this typical Western comment on the role of revelation in religious truth. Revelation is not oracular. Propositions do not descend on us from heaven ready made, but are more a draft of work in progress than a final and completed document. For faith itself, though rooted in immutable truth, is not crowning knowledge, and is its elaboration and teaching, namely theology, is still more bound up with discourses, progressively manifesting fresh truths or fresh aspects of truth to the mind. So the individual Christian and the Christian community grow in understanding. Indeed, they must, if like other living organisms, they are to survive by adaptation to a changing environment of history, ideas, and social pressures. Okay. All right, I think I'm just going to stop reading right there for now. Page 1230. All right, so he was just kind of going through the whole existentialist thing there, where basically, went from like Hegel to Marx, and then they're like, you can't really ever know if anything's true or not, and so therefore, nature's just like a bunch of like matter swirling around, and it doesn't really have any purpose or value, so therefore there is not really any truth except for your own conscious experiences, and whatever those are subjective to you, right? And that's where we get the whole like left-wing thought where a man can become a woman, and math isn't real anymore, right? Literature just doesn't have like the same symbolic meanings anymore. Now it's just a vehicle for propaganda and brainwashing. It's not like you're actually trying to like get people to like think or like pass down some type of like traditional information, like how the old like stories used to be, like the old traditional stories, either like spoken word or later on like written down, like the Iliad and Odyssey. It was like to teach like a cultural value, a cultural tradition, and to like install these things in people's minds and in the entire culture. But now literature, art, all this stuff, it's just used as a vehicle of power because they don't even believe in like morals and values and goals and all that stuff, right? It's just about power. So it's just used as a vehicle of power to inject their ideas into your brain, because that's all it is. It's just your brain's just a computer that receives information and processes it like an algorithm, right? So if they just use the art and the thing that your brain was programmed like over thousands of years to like be able to interpret the world through stories and narratives and art and all this stuff, and now they just use it to pump their stuff into your brain. They're like, okay, well, we can just pump stuff into your brain and make you think a certain way. And since, like he's saying, most people don't think, he's kind of saying they're NPCs. He's kind of calling them NPCs a little bit there. The majority of people are either NPCs, or if they are smart enough to figure it out, they just don't care because they're too busy at work. And then there's the third group of people that are just going to be against whatever the current thing is, right? And then he's kind of implying, it seems like he's implying that the religious context definitely does have some value in the fact that it's the only thing that can make truth claims in the society. And so therefore, even though they're abstract truth claims, it is the only thing that can make truth claims, value claims, purpose claims, stuff like that. So we'll see where he goes from there. That's it for the video. Thanks for watching if you did. If you didn't, you won't hear this anyway. So have a good day and peace.